For 1 hour and 20 minutes. Is there objection? Without objection, is so ordered.
Sanders gets 40 and Mr. Lightfoot gets 40.
Gentleman from Vermont is recognized for 40 minutes. The gentleman from Iowa is recognized for 40 minutes. Gentleman
Thank you,
from
Mr.
Vermont.
Chairman.
Gentleman from Vermont.
Can we have some order, please?
The gentleman's point of order is very well taken. The committee is not in order. With the conversation taking place to the chair's left, please retire to the cloakroom.
No.
Would members please take their conversations off the floor, including staff members from the Speaker's office. The gentleman from Vermont.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, this is a simple and straightforward amendment which should be supported by progressives, by conservatives, by moderates, and everybody else. It should, in fact, be supported by every member of Congress who is concerned about the proper separation of powers as defined by our Constitution and who cares about fiscal responsibility. This amendment prevents the President of the United States, Bill Clinton, or any future president from appropriating money from the Exchange Stabilization Fund to bail out Mexico or any other country without the approval of Congress. In January of this year, the President announced that he felt it necessary to bail out the Mexican economy as a result of the devaluation of the peso. He initially indicated that he wanted congressional approval for his bailout and, in fact, won early support from congressional leaders of both parties. However, it soon became clear to the administration that they did not have the support for this bailout from a majority of the members of Congress or from the American people. Poll after poll showed overwhelming opposition to the bailout, and more members of Congress, Republicans, Democrats, and the Independent, voiced disapproval of the bailout. Mr. Speaker, understanding that he did not have the votes in Congress to go forward with this proposal, President Clinton acted unilaterally and provided Mexico with a minimum of $20 billion in loans and loan guarantees. $20 billion. Mr. Chairman, this amendment is not about the wisdom or the folly of President Clinton's action in January, or how successful or unsuccessful it might have been. That is an important discussion, but not the main focus of my amendment. This amendment deals with one fundamental issue, and that is whether the Congress of the United States accept its responsibility under the Constitution to appropriate funds, or whether it will continue to abdicate that responsibility to the executive branch. That is the issue under discussion. If members of this body support the $20 billion loan and loan guarantee program developed by the President for Mexico, they have every right to get on this floor to fight for that funding and to win a majority of the members. Maybe they can and maybe they can't. I don't know. But I do know that it is cowardly, irresponsible, and probably unconstitutional for the Congress to abdicate its responsibility on this issue and not vote on the matter. Not vote on the matter. Mr. Chairman, during the last several weeks, we have been having heated debates on the floor of the House about whether to appropriate $2 million for this program or $20 million for that project. Debates have gone on hour after hour, and some of them have been extremely heated. In every case, the final decision was made by a vote in this body in which every member participated, and that is the way it is supposed to be. Mr. Chairman, how can we spend hour after hour debating a $5 million appropriation but not have any debate, not have any votes, when we are talking about putting at risk $20 billion of taxpayer money, as was the case with the bailout for Mexico? How can we ask our constituents back home to put up all of this money when we have not cast a vote on it? It seems to me to be absurd that we have dozens and dozens of votes for small appropriations, but no vote for a $20 billion appropriation, which puts at risk so much of our taxpayers' money. I might add for the members that if they think this issue is past history, they are wrong. The Treasury Department has already indicated in a public hearing that there is a possibility that they may be back for more money for the Mexican bailout in fiscal year '96. Will the Congress cop out again? Or will we have the guts to accept our responsibility? Mr. Chairman, this legislation should be supported in bipartisan fashion, and I'm delighted that we will have members from both parties speaking in support of this amendment. This amendment should also not be considered as an attack on President Clinton because it will apply to all presidents from here on in. Mr. Chairman, I reserve the balance. I yield back. Now, what do I do?
Vermont reserves the balance of his time.
I reserve
the balance of his time. Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Does the gentleman from Iowa wish to yield time?
Thank you.
Chairman, yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
And Mr. Chairman, also would like to get unanimous consent to yield half of my time, 20 minutes of my time, to the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Hoyer, that he could control that 20 minutes.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And in doing that, I also would like to, on behalf of our side at least, offer an apology to Mr. Hoyer over the incident that Mr. Obey brought to the floor. I totally agree with Mr. Obey. It was totally uncalled for, and that sort of thing should not happen in this House. And I don't know who did it, but I would offer my apologies to Mr. Hoyer in lieu of anyone else.
What purpose does the gentleman from Maryland rise?
On the chairman's...
Speak of personal privilege for 1 minute out of order.
Without objection, the gentleman is...
I want to thank the member. Ladies and gentlemen of this House, the issues with which we deal are emotional. There are a lot of strong feelings on both sides of the issues. We are in different parties and sometimes antagonistic to one another's interests, and we are protagonists in debate. But the distribution of materials which are false, which are misleading, and in this case totally inaccurate, is undermining of the comedy that we ought to have in this body. I try to treat every person in this body with respect. And in return, I expect to be treated with respect.
I may have differed with the gentleman then and now, but with the understanding that bad news could always break out at any time, it's clear that to date, the Mexican initiative appears to be working. The chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, for instance, testified this morning before the committee that both the gentleman from Vermont and I sit on, that it is working maximally. This member believes it has probably moved from a 60 to 70% likelihood of success to an 80 to 90% likelihood of success. Indeed, from an American perspective, the embarrassment could be that it appears that we will be making a great deal of money on the loans and loan commitments we have made, with our lending costs being almost twice the cost of borrowing to the Federal Treasury. And here, let me just stress, not only if the program works will we be making money, but we will be avoiding far greater consequences in the country of Mexico, which could have precipitated massive flows of illegal immigrants, which would have been substantially more costly to the United States taxpayer and to our own system of governance. The irony is that this amendment, as it's brought before this body, disallows the United States of America from using the Exchange Stabilization Fund to defend the dollar. The irony also is that we might be precluded from actually receiving a profit on the risk we have taken. Both of these are counterproductive circumstances. But those aren't the only ironies that's troubling. For a Congress that favors presumably stability in the world, we by this approach would be introducing a new massive element of instability in exchange rates. For a Congress that wants to be cohesive, we make it very difficult to be credible if we attempt to seek punitive actions against those responsible for a policy the leadership of this Congress signed off on. And by leadership, I mean the leadership of both parties. I recognize we have an honest difference of opinion on the Mexican policy, but this approach has the effect of standing as much as a vote of no confidence against the Speaker and the Majority Leader and the Minority Leader as it does the President of the United States. Let me also stress that if we look at the Mexican issue, it strikes me this administration gets pretty good marks for how it handled the crisis once it developed. The marks, if one is taking a historical perspective that wants to criticize the administration, that are less than good are the reasons that the crisis was precipitated in the first place. And on those grounds, the administration, particularly in 1994, could come under a reasonable criticism. But for what has been done in 1995, in my judgment, there is an excellent chance that this will be considered one of the great successes, not failures, of this administration. Let me also say, I think it's important to look to the future. And as we look to the future, it strikes me as very self-apparent that the international community did not have at its disposal the right kinds of equipment and capacities to deal with a crisis of this nature. We probably moved maximally a $50 billion worldwide system of support, 40% of which came from the United States. It's clear that this war for economic stability was probably the most the international community could deal with, and we don't have the capacity to fight 2 wars or 3 or 4. And so the issue for the future is how you develop.
Gentleman's time has expired.
If I may ask the gentleman for an additional minute.
I'd grant 1 additional minute.
Gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
The challenge is for this body, instead of sniping at a past decision, which in my judgment represented extraordinary courage in the behalf of this president who was reeling from weakness, of this congressional leadership which was new in office, of a presidency in Mexico which was brand new, that responded collectively with surprising wisdom. The challenge for this body is to look to the future and develop ways for the international community to share in the kinds of obligations that come into place when this kind of crisis emerges for the future. And instead of sniping, what we ought to be looking at are constructive efforts to improve both international law and international institutions to take the burden off individual countries' publics as the risk was put on the United States public, a risk, by the way, at this point, which looks as if was well merited, and it looks as if is going to produce a profit. And so I would only say to the distinguished gentleman that I think this amendment should respectfully be defeated.
The gentleman from Vermont.
Chairman, I yield 5 minutes to the gentlelady from Ohio, Marcy Kaplan.
The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding and want to rise in very strong support of the Sanders amendment. And to my good friend from Iowa, Mr. Leach, let me say what is going on here has nothing to do with sniping. It has nothing to do with the new president and nothing to do with the new leadership in the Congress. It has everything to do with the establishment of precedent in a republic that is over 200 years old. And I want to commend Mr. Sanders for forcing us to meet our constitutional responsibilities. If any member believes it is wrong that the government of the United States, by the agreement of perhaps 6 men, decided to send billions of dollars to Mexico to bail out their investments without a vote of Congress, without a vote of Congress. If you believe that was wrong, as I do, you will support the Sanders amendment. The backdoor use of an obscure fund at Treasury called the Economic Stabilization Fund, a fund that the Clinton administration essentially raided with the collusion of about 4 leaders in this House and a few over in the Senate, is unprecedented. In both magnitude of the dollars involved, the purposes for which the fund was originally established several decades ago, and also the duration and risk attached to what has been done. I really respect my colleague from Iowa as a staunch defender of our Constitution, and thus it surprises me a bit to hear you argue in the way you have argued this afternoon. Our country has, if you will let me just finish this thought, our country has never extended loans to a foreign country on a medium or long-term basis from this fund. Never $20 billion and more of commitment. This particular commitment was 20 times as large as any prior use of this fund. Never has it been the will of this Congress to provide the executive branch with unlimited authority of this sort. I would yield to the gentleman at this point.
I would only make one modest point. I think on several of the points the gentlelady is correct. On the points of precedent, though, I would say that the fund was set up for this purpose and has been used for this purpose in the past, but never at this magnitude. The magnitude is unprecedented. That is the unprecedented point, but the legal authority is there, and we have carefully reviewed that legal authority. And so in a constitutional circumstance, I would beg to differ.
Well, this is, if I might reclaim my time from the gentleman, this is where the nub of the argument really lies in terms of the Constitution. Because when this fund was established, the purpose was to prop up the dollar, not the peso. The purpose of the fund was for short-term currency exchanges, not medium-term loans, not long-term loans, for another government,
to
refinance its investors, those people that had speculated in that market. And I think that the gentleman, being a party to the agreement, obviously would want to defend it. But I think that when you have a backdoor form of foreign aid, this is not healthy. This is not healthy for our country. It is not healthy for the confidence of members here, nor of the American people. We should have a debate. What is so troubling about this particular matter is we have never been allowed to have a full debate on the floor of this Congress. It has been bottled up by the committees of jurisdiction. Our efforts to get discharge petitions signed have been very interesting to watch, to move this bill to the floor in other forms. But I think the gentleman's point is incorrect. In fact, this fund was established to prop up the dollar.
Will the
not
yield
any
on that
form
point?
of exchange. I'd be happy to yield to the gentleman.
The gentlelady is precisely correct. However, the law was on what the fund was set up to do under original law, but the law was changed in 1977 under the Gold Reserve Act. And it was precisely changed to allow greater flexibility in usage of these funds, and they've been used for this purpose many times since 1977, with full concurrence of the Congress of the United States.
If the gentleman could yield me an extra minute. Let me just say that
one additional minute.
Historically, the fund was never used either for this magnitude, this duration, or this purpose. What has happened during the 1980s, and this is why I call this a backdoor form of foreign aid, if this was necessary to prop up the political environment of this continent and of this hemisphere, then that's what the debate ought to be about. But the fact is, we took over $20 billion of our taxpayers' money and put it at risk. It is still at risk. The long-term debt of Mexico, and if you look at what's happening with the internal dynamics of that country, with its private banks, with the loans that are owned by the private sector, this isn't over, as my good friend knows, probably as well as anyone in this institution. This is not the way to do it. This is not the way to do it. I think you are creating a real paradox inside for members who may wish to have an open debate on the merits of how we relate to Mexico, but I think this completely erodes that confidence.
The gentlelady has expired. Gentleman from Maryland.
Mr. Chairman, I yield 4 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Benson.
Gentleman is recognized for 4 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Chairman, let me start out by saying that it would be nice if we could go back to a time where we could live within our borders, trade within our borders, our economy would remain within our borders, and we wouldn't have to worry about what goes on in other countries. But that time has long passed. And the problem with this amendment is that it tries to take us back to where we can't go. It guts our policy as a nation to intervene in the world currency markets, in particular to defend the dollar, and that would be a big mistake. We must not tie the hands of any administration to protect the dollar. In the last 18 months, we've seen dramatic drops in the value of the dollar, and we've seen some efforts where the dollar has started to stabilize. To do this today would undermine those efforts. And then the result would be a continuing fall of the dollar, a rise in interest rates, a rise in mortgage rates, and that would be detrimental to our economy, which I think would be contrary to what the proponents are trying to accomplish. And I'll yield in a second as soon as I finish my statement. Second of all, let's talk a little bit about Mexico. And I don't disagree with the proponents wanting to come down and debate the issue of Mexico. I am more than willing to come down and debate it. But let's talk about a couple of facts with regards to Mexico. Number one, it is our third largest trading partner. Those facts will not change. Number two, we know that exports are down to Mexico in part because of the economic situation that has gone on there. But we have to remember that if we hadn't taken care of this situation, that exports would have been way down in Mexico, and we would have had an economic collapse on our hands. And there are 80 million people who live there, and they aren't going anywhere. They aren't going to move anywhere. They're going to be there along the border, a 2,000-mile border with the United States. So we have no choice but to face up to the situation and deal with it. I would agree with the distinguished chairman of the Banking Committee that the policy does appear to be working. And I would argue that the figures are not exactly correct, because it appears to this point that we have issued loan guarantees and Treasury swaps in the range of about $10.5 to $11 billion, not $20 billion. But the policy does appear to be working. Mexico has been able to re-enter the capital markets. It's been able to have more capital inflow into the country, and that will work to our benefit. Now, let me address another issue that I think is a myth that has been out there. There are a lot who believe that our policy was geared primarily to the benefit of Wall Street investment bankers. But the fact of the matter is that over 50% of the bonds, the Mexican Treasury bonds, which would have defaulted, were held by U.S. institutional investors. U.S. institutional investors are not one or two people who reside on Wall Street. They are pension funds. I'll yield in just a second. They are pension funds. They are people like you and me who invest in 401ks, in our savings, in our retirement. That is who institutional investors are.
For a point of clarification, would the gentleman
I'd be glad to yield, and then I owe you a yield.
Are you speaking of the Tese Bonos?
Yes.
The gentleman is aware that the Tese Bonos, while indexed to the dollar, were payable in pesos, not in dollars. Why does the gentleman believe they would have defaulted?
I believe they would have, reclaiming my time, I believe that they would have defaulted if there was a collapse. If we had not stepped in, if we had allowed the Mexican economy to collapse, I think that they wouldn't have been able to make their payments.
Would you yield further?
I'd be glad to yield.
Does the Mexican government not have the sovereign capacity to issue pesos to repay their sovereign debt?
The Mexican government does have the ability to do... Expired. Can I have 1 minute? Just to finish.
Let me give you 30 seconds because we got very limited time.
Let me finish my statement very quickly and say this amendment is misguided. I understand your concern on the policy, and I'd be glad to debate that. But this is an economic, this is a straitjacket on our policy to intervene in the currency markets, which any nation, particularly this nation, should have the ability to do. It's a mercantilist policy which is misguided. I'd be glad to yield.
Thank you very much. I'll just say that is exactly what we want. We want a debate on the merits of the policy and the precedent being established. You made the statement that
reclaiming my time, that is fine, but let's not tie the hands of any administration to intervene in the currency markets to defend the dollar.
Let's do it under the law.
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Vermont.
I yield 5 minutes to the gentlelady from Missouri, Ms. Dana.
Gentlelady from Missouri has yielded how much time? 5 minutes.
5 minutes.
5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in support of the Sanders Amendment to suspend funding for dispersing exchange stabilization funds to Mexico. Because I know everyone here is aware of the origins of the $48 billion Mexican bailout package, I will not review it again. However, I want to be sure that we all remember that, despite the size of this bailout, Congress has never directly voted on whether or not to approve it. While this amendment will not immediately cut off funding, it will show that Congress is unwilling to relinquish our control over our nation's spending. Mr. Chairman, I think the House should also be aware that as this year has progressed, unappropriated money has continued to flow to Mexico. In fact, by late May, Mexico had already borrowed the maximum amount the Treasury Department allowed to be dispersed before July 1st. On June 29th, Mexico announced that they will draw down an additional $5.5 billion of the $10 billion which become available July 1st. In addition, the U.S.-backed IMF has loaned the Mexican government $8 billion. Where has the bailout money gone? Well, of the $17 billion Mexico has borrowed through the bailout package, they have spent $6 billion to redeem dollar-denominated bonds, $3 billion to pay off public debt, $4 billion to pay off dollar deposits withdrawn from Mexican banks, and $2 billion to enable Mexican companies to redeem foreign debts. This money didn't go to the Mexican people. This money went to foreign investors who made a bad investment decision and are now being spared the consequences because the U.S. taxpayer is paying for their mistakes. Let me repeat that. The Mexican people did not benefit by this. It was the foreign investors who had made bad mistakes, and now the American taxpayer is asked to bail them out. I know this amendment will not bring back the money that has already gone to Mexico, and it won't immediately stop additional taxpayer dollars from flowing to Mexico. However, and importantly, it will allow Congress to reclaim our constitutional role in controlling the spending of taxpayers' money for the next fiscal year, and that is certainly the very least we can do. I urge all members to support the Sanders Amendment. Thank you. I yield back the balance of my time.
Who wishes to yield time?
Do you want to yield to me?
The gentleman from Iowa.
Mr. Chairman, very pleased to yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. De La Garza.
The gentleman from Texas is yielded to 5 minutes.
I thank my distinguished colleague and my colleagues of the House. Listening to the distinguished chairman of the Banking Committee, I was very happy that he said the facts, gave the accurate description of what this fund is. What I'm going to very respectfully and quite reluctantly have to explain is that this is no more, no less than Mexico bashing. We're still fighting NAFTA. We didn't fight Canada. We didn't argue about Canada. We argued about Mexico. And let me give you some facts. Mexico is not going to be swallowed by the ocean. It's going to be there. What we do with Mexico to stabilize the peso is for my side of the river, for the United States of American side of the river. When the peso is weak for whatever reason, it's McAllen and San Antonio and Dallas and Houston. But what disturbs me the most is that in the debate in NAFTA, and I hate to go back to it, we got to a Mexico bashing. I share blood with the Mexicans, and I resent any type of accusation. They discussed about the environmental, that Mexico would not fulfill the obligations. I'm going to put in the record later a story about how U.S. companies are complaining how harsh Mexico is treating them about cleaning up the environment. U.S. companies are saying the Mexicans they've closed 28 in the state of Tamaulipas. They sanctioned about 80. But here we're still saying, oh, they're not cleaning up the environment. Mexicans died for the United States of America. There is a Medal of Honor winner from Mexico. They're our brothers. They're our neighbors. They will not go away. They will not be swallowed by the ocean. It's time we put, yes, we should correct, but I doubt that there is any, I don't know what word to use, integrity in an argument about the fund when we know what motivates the problem with the fund. And how much money did we go to Mexico? For the Mexicans. They buy everything from us. My side of the river is suffering. They're asking me, can you get us SBA loans? Because we're losing all this business that isn't coming from Mexico. Mexico has been our stern ally politically, socially, economically. And let me tell you, the best interests of the United States of America demand, our very national security demands a stable Mexico, socially, economically, politically. That's why we at times intervene in Mexican politics to try and make them more equal to ours in their commerce. But the bottom line, my dear friends, is that we took, the United States of America, 2/3 of the territory of Mexico, in a war that is yet to be explained. In a war that is yet to be explained. Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California. But now we are on an alien bashing binge in California, the Northeast, anything that doesn't look like us. Blonde, blue-eyed, tall. Would you believe I have Irish blood? I have Italian blood. My children have, through my wife, German blood. My family came when it was Spain. They lived there when it was Mexico. They lived there when it was Texas. They lived there when we were Confederates. But we are citizens of the United States of America. And anyone for any other reason than the fact demeans the Mexican people, I resent, because I share blood with them. And it's unfortunate that this issue has been brought up. And I have no question about the seriousness of the gentleman who offered the amendment. But it's being used for all the other purposes. We want the Vietnamese out of California. We want the Salvadorians out of California. We don't want the Mexicans anymore. They're getting our political, they're getting our social, they're coming to get aid of some kind.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman has yielded 1 additional minute.
That should not be the issue. Everyone that is here, with the exception of probably my dear good friend Mr. Lightfoot and Senator Campbell, everyone that is here came, or their ancestors came, as aliens. And you demean your ancestry when you now say, oh, the aliens are taking over our country. The aliens aren't taking over our country. And we should stick to the facts. But I cannot, because I see beyond the eyes of the debate. And speaking of the debate, I see bashing Mexico. That's not correct. That's not proper. And the best interests of the United States of America demand a stable Mexico. And anything that we do, this stabilizing the Mexican peso was done for the state of Texas and Ohio and Indiana and all the people that sell in Mexico. So I would
will the gentleman yield to me for, I ask unanimous consent he be given half a minute, additional half a minute.
The time is controlled, I would say, to the gentleman from Texas.
Steny, will you yield a half a minute?
A minute to my friend from Texas.
I wanted to ask the gentleman to yield to identify with him. We're fellow Texans, and we have a very similar, almost identical background, and I identify with him. And just to clarify the point that I have often and repeatedly said, when I've been called a Hispanic, I said, no, I'm not Hispanic, I'm just a plain old Mexican. So the fact is that where we come from and what we identify with, and up in these sections of the country, the history that's ignored,
time of the gentleman has expired.
I thank the gentleman for recalling it.
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Vermont.
The speech from the gentleman from Texas.
Does the gentleman yield himself time?
Yes.
Such time as he may consume?
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The speech from the gentleman from Texas was very moving and interesting, but totally irrelevant to what we are talking about right now. And I bitterly resent the gentleman's suggestion that anyone here is Mexico bashing. The issue is whether the taxpayers of the United States will put at risk $20 billion without one word of discussion or one vote on the floor of the House. And if the gentleman disagrees with me, then he should participate in that debate on the floor of the House. Maybe he will win, maybe he won't. But that's the way democracy works, and that's what the Constitution mandates. Mr. Chairman, I'm proud to yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from California, Mr. Cox.
Gentleman from California.